Thank you very much, Oscar, for the introduction. Thanks to PARCC for inviting me to come speak here and for what looks like it will be a growing partnership between PARCC and the new Rise Up project that Oscar mentioned briefly. I also want to thank all of the activists and organizers and organizations that I've worked with, particularly over the past couple of years, but also over many, many years. Work for social justice is collaborative work, it's community work. It's not things that individuals do, it's what we do collectively. And I particularly want to mention some of the organizations locally that I think have done really important work in recent years. The Cny Solidarity Coalition that I'll reference extensively, the Workers' Center of Central New York, the Syracuse Peace Council, Black Lives Matter, New York Civil Liberties Union, New Feminists for Justice, Planned Parenthood, the National Action Network, Spanish Action League, and there are many, many others as well. So I want to start, before I sort of get into things, so raise your hand if you've engaged in some sort of social justice related work since the 2016 presidential election. Okay, so many of you. Great. So that just confirms the idea that this is collective work. And my hope is that a year from now, if we were to gather again, many of those of you who didn't raise your hand may raise your hands at that point. So first I want to talk about organizing. And in the introduction, Oscar talked about organizing and activism. And there are two ideas that come together, but they're not the same. You know, activism means engaging in some sort of activity. It could be a protest, a sit-in, knocking on doors as part of a campaign, going to meetings, challenging public officials, writing letters to public officials or the editor. Organizing is about trying to make that work effective, right? So here's a definition. And I changed it since when I was working on the slideshow, so I'm going to read it from the screen. So I understand organizing as a process of bringing people together to build our power and create the changes we seek. It requires us to build relationships, develop leadership and other specific skills, and analyze the challenges we face and the resources that we can assemble to create effective strategies for change. So that's the last time I'm going to be looking much at the screen. I don't know about you all, but I hate going to presentations where I could just watch the slides. So I'm not going to do that. So in many ways, the title of this is about social justice organizing in the age of Trump. In many ways, social justice organizing in the age of Trump is just the same as social justice organizing at any time in any place, right? It's about understanding what's happening in your community, what people are concerned about, and helping them mobilize to move forward and create change. So in many ways, it's no different from any other situation. But this current situation is a rather different situation, certainly from my belief, different from anything I've experienced in the 35 plus years that I've been working as an organizer. And I've tried to draw from and understand the history of social movements that have come before. And I think clearly we're at a rather unique moment in US history, and a particularly dangerous moment. So after the election of 2016, when Trump, surprisingly to many of us, won the presidency, the Syracuse Peace Council and the Workers' Center of Central New York called an emergency demonstration. That was the day after the election, that evening. Over 100 people came out. There was a real sense of we need to get moving right away, that this is a new, different sort of situation. Out of that, meetings started very quickly. So, and this was, much of this happened at a time of year when it's difficult to organize as you're getting to Thanksgiving and then the December holidays, and schools you all here are finishing up your classes, doing your final exams, all of that. So it's a difficult time to organize. But despite that, large numbers of people quickly began coming out to meetings. And much of that work developed into what we came to call the Cny Solidarity Coalition. And we identified our work as wanting to protect those who are most threatened by Trump's rhetoric and the policies that he was promoting, to resist those policies at every level we could, to work for changes in those policies over the long term, and to hold elected leaders accountable, and if need be, replace them with others who would listen to the demands of the people. So Cny Solidarity started at that time, as did New Feminists for Justice, several other local groups, and there was also the launch nationally of what became the Indivisible movement. This is an effort that was conceived by people who were former staff people for Congress, who saw what was happening as something quite dangerous. They also, most of them had been congressional staffers during the time of the Tea Party, when conservatives organized under Obama to try and thwart most of his policy initiatives. And so they had seen some of the effectiveness of that, as they had been sort of the targets of it to a large degree. So they began to put out materials based on their experience and their learnings about how progressive folks could work for social justice more effectively within the system. And some of that thinking was based on the idea that, to a large degree, many progressive activists, myself included, had not spent a lot of time working on electoral political issues. We'd worked on issue campaigns, on trying to stop the danger of nuclear weapons or nuclear power, to protect immigrants, to protect the environment, to get us to respond to concerns about climate change, to deal with police accountability and the scourge of particularly young black men being murdered by police. So people worked on those various issues. But after Trump's election, there was a feeling among many of us that we need to think a little bit more about this electoral piece, because it really is rather significant. At the same time, in many ways, I think what we're taught in this country, and I think in other countries as well, is that that participating in elections is all there is in political engagement. That's what civic means. It's fulfilling your responsibility to participate in elections. And certainly I'm advocating that that's an important piece of our responsibility, but it extends well beyond that. So what's not different since Trump's election? And this is something that many people, particularly white people, white middle and upper class people who were reasonably liberal in their thinking, were shocked to see that many people of color didn't understand what had happened as an earthquake. They didn't understand that the world had changed the way many of us had perceived it to. And that's because they had already been suffering so much in terms of police brutality, in terms of unemployment, in terms of blighted communities. Hopefully, many of you are aware that Syracuse is perhaps the worst city in the country in terms of the rate of poverty for Black and Latino children in the entire United States. So that's a really damning statistic that we need to find ways to address and to make right. So for many people who that's their experience, it didn't necessarily feel like that big a deal. At the same time, people of color who I know, for the most part, and many of us who are white as well, took great pride in the election of the first African-American president, that symbolically that was hugely important. And I know that it was actually shortly after the election that PBS aired these documentaries about Michelle Obama bringing much of the cast of the Broadway musical Hamilton to the White House and bringing lots of kids from the Washington, D.C. schools, kids who, for the most part, had little access to Broadway-style theater. And there were these amazing moments, of this cast, of this transformative play, Hamilton, and these kids who, getting to see these people of color who are performing and revising U.S. history. And so it's quite sad to see that at the same moment that we're preparing for the Obamas to leave the White House and the Trumps to move into it. And part of one of the lessons of that is that those of us who are white, those of us who benefit from white privilege, need to do more to really understand the experiences of our colleagues who are people of color. as well as all marginalized peoples, that it's people who are stuck in the back are looking forward. So they see what people who are wealthier than them, who are more privileged than them, they see what that life is like. If they turn on the TV, they see it all the time. But rarely do others of us, look back and see what other people who are experiencing, have things far more difficult than we do. Another thing that wasn't different, although again, it was wonderful to have such a thoughtful person in the White House as President Obama, saying lots of great things. But in terms of immigration issues, under Obama, more people were deported than under any other president in U.S. history. So in some way, the rhetoric certainly shifted when Trump was elected. The build that wall stuff and that sort of screeching hatred of people coming from Latin America is different. But not such big policy changes initially. And in terms of economics, the recovery that Trump wants to claim credit for began and built great momentum while Obama was president. So unemployment, went down very, very significantly. But for most average workers, wages didn't rise significantly. So people were still struggling to be able to pay for their kids to go to college, struggling to be able to pay their rent or their mortgage payments and live comfortable lives. So that was another issue that the promise of social justice we never got close to that. And related to that economic globalization, the forces of free trade, et cetera, marched forward, enriching the few and giving much, much more power to corporations at the expense of the many, both here in the United States and across the globe. And ironically, one of the things Trump did was to criticize that whole regime and has undercut it to some degree. I have no confidence that he wants to replace it with anything that is more fair or just or helps people more, but nonetheless, he did say this is not good. So those are some things that aren't different. What is different? Because there obviously are key issues. One is that massive numbers of people were energized. As CNY Solidarity got going, we had to find new places to meet because we were overflowing meeting places that in the past would have been much too large for us to meet in. And that was great. And many of those people had never engaged in social activism before. Others had during the Vietnam War or on some other issue 20, 30 years ago and hadn't really engaged since then. So that was really important. Racism was openly embraced from the White House, and policies were discussed and efforts to move forward on them that would expand and increase the power of racism. So presumably everyone is aware of what happened in Charlottesville and Trump's response to that. Lack of enforcement of voting rights and efforts to further limit and cut back on voting rights. Efforts to destroy environmental justice initiatives, which fuse together issues of social justice and environmental protection, recognizing that in many, many situations, the people who suffer most from environmental degradation and pollution are poor people who are trapped in communities where coal plants are built or other noxious facilities are sited. Misogyny, the hatred and mistreatment of women, again, openly embraced from the White House. The Access Hollywood tapes came out, a month or so before the elections, and who would have thought that someone saying those things could be elected after that, but it happened. And has continued in terms of Trump's attacks on individual women who challenge him, and attacks on reproductive rights, a core piece of independence for women. Other forms of bigotry in a broad way, oppression of LGBT people, trying to roll back marriage equality, to turn back rights that trans people have gained, to use bathrooms that they identify, of the gender they identify with, to serve openly in the military. Not an institution that I embrace in many ways, but nonetheless, if we're going to have it, there should be equality there as well. Threats to health care and all other forms of human services. Climate change denial front and center. And this is an issue that for years I was very disappointed that Obama didn't try to move ahead more aggressively to confront climate change. But nonetheless, there was recognition that it existed, and the Paris Climate Accords probably were the best we could have hoped for, given that the Senate would have voted down any treaty that was brought before them. So as a result of that, the Paris Climate Accord wasn't a treaty that required ratification in that way, but was rather an agreement that sought to build momentum among all the nations of the world towards reducing carbon emissions. And then threats to the foundation of democracy itself. The Trump very openly embraces authoritarian leaders and attacks the media, does all the things that are classical tactics of fascism. I'll stop here. So one of the things that we focused on a lot, right, here in central New York, we have 3 federal elected representatives. A congressional representative who's John Katko, who is targeted here as part of this demonstration, and there were dozens and dozens of demonstrations targeting him. And then we have 2 U.S. senators, not Hillary Clinton anymore, Kirsten Gillibrand and Charles Schumer. And Schumer and Gillibrand, for the most part, have agreed with many of the basic demands that we've made. And for the first time in my recollection as an organizer in this community, we've actually had meetings with their staff that were more strategy meetings about how do we work together to try and block some of these things they're trying to do in Congress? How do we work together to move some progressive things forward? Katko, on the other hand, has been a completely different story. He identifies and promotes himself as a moderate, and in many ways he's not among the far right of the Republican Party. He occasionally has voted against the Trump administration, but 90% of the time he votes with them. And a key piece that we were saying is, we need you to meet with us. We are upset, we are scared, and you need to meet with your constituents. And he continuously refused to do that. So we held a couple of these town hall meetings ourselves where we invited him, reached out to him, tried to get him to come. He refused to come, so we held them without him and had powerful opportunities for constituents to be able to speak out and share their concerns. And we tried to get the media to cover it widely as well. And I don't know if people know, but that's Chris Bolt, the news director of WAER, the radio station based here at Syracuse University. And WAER co-sponsored this town hall meeting and recorded it and broadcast most of it afterwards. So we tried to get TV stations to do it instead, and we're hoping that if we could get one of the local TV stations to collaborate with us on this, that would shame Katko into giving in and joining us. But none of them had the courage to do it without him. They all said, oh, if he'll agree, we'll do it. And we said, but your job is to hold him accountable, not to let him determine what's okay and what's not okay. But none of them were willing to do their job, in my estimation. Did I skip over that fascism slide? Oh, maybe that didn't make it in here. No. Okay. So when I was preparing for this presentation, I reached out to a number of my colleagues, folks who I've worked with, whose judgment I really value, to ask for their input. And one of the people who responded was Ursula Rosem, who's also a former staff person at the Peace Council and has been working on single-payer health care for a number of years now. And she wrote something that I thought was really useful to quote directly. She said, "The brutality of the Trump era is creating the conditions for more radical demands to emerge. The movements that I think are noteworthy based on my proximity are First, Medicare for all has more support now than ever previously, and this has been fueled in large part by the attacks on the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and the unapologetic greed of the insurance companies and big pharmaceuticals. And second, the brutal deportation machine has re-energized the immigrants' rights movement to the point where we are talking about abolishing ICE, abolishing the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Agency. And even a number of elected officials have supported that demand. So, what are some of the things that we've learned as we've been engaging in this work, right? Because good organizers are constantly trying to learn. We try something, we see how it works in some ways, not so successful in other ways, and how do we revise that and adjust it? So first, that even in a situation like this, where Trump is the president, the Republicans have had control of both the House and Senate. The Senate has changed its rules to a large degree to allow them to do things that they couldn't have done before by limiting the ability to filibuster. So, but despite that, we have either delayed or stopped many things that they tried to do. You know, Trump came in with this Muslim ban immediately, and people spoke out very powerfully against it. We got support from the courts. So this is a protest here that many of you probably recall that we began to see these massive protests in airports in different parts of the country, and we hadn't talked about doing anything here in Syracuse. And Syracuse, while they call it Hancock International Airport, it's not particularly an international destination, so there aren't lots of flights coming in from the Middle East or elsewhere. But because this was mushrooming in other places, we said, well, we should do this too. So we put out a call on, I think, Saturday afternoon for a protest on Sunday late afternoon, early evening, and it just spread like wildfire. I was called by the woman who's the director of the Syracuse airport, who found me through Facebook because I had created the Facebook event, saying, you know, we see you're doing this. We can't say that you can do it, but we're not going to stop you from doing it this time. You know, please try not to be too disruptive. So we went. There were 900 people who showed up. We were loud. We took over the baggage claim area completely. Lots of energy and chanting. And the security left us completely to be. And Mayor Stephanie Miner, who is no longer the mayor, came and spoke in support along with many, many other people. So it was a very powerful moment. So another important lesson that I referenced a little bit earlier, that elections have consequences and that we need to begin thinking towards the next elections, which are the midterms coming up. And I hope that those of you who are registered as Democrats will vote in the election, the primary tomorrow, and then that all of you will participate in the midterms on November 6th. We've also learned that the divisions in this country are really deep, and in some ways this shouldn't be any surprise, right? Many of you will remember when Bill Clinton was elected president, that he was vilified by the right, and they came after him for all kinds of crazy things. And that continued into the presidential election, and frankly is one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton lost, was because of that built up baggage and hatred toward initially Bill, and then towards Hillary as well. So we need to continue to think about how we can work in ways that both stand firm for what we believe in, but also which try to reach across that divide, to recognize that there are commonalities that we have with people who support Trump. And I was a strong supporter of Bernie Sanders, and initially was so confused when I ran into people who said, well, I'll either support Bernie or I'll support Trump. And for me, they were like, complete opposite ends of the spectrum. But as I heard people talk more, there were some similarities. Both of them were saying that the system is broken, that it does not meet the needs of ordinary people, and it needs to be changed in a more transformative way, not just tinkering at the edges. Obviously, the kinds of changes and that they sought were very, very different. So that's an important challenge to us moving forward. A second piece, or a last piece in terms of lessons learned, is that we need to be prepared to do this work in the long term. That we didn't get to this point where someone like Trump could be elected overnight, and we're not going to change things in a way that we could proudly say we live in a country that embraces social justice, that lives out those ideas in the way our society is structured, the way people are treated. So we need to think in the long term and develop the kinds of institutions that will build and sustain social movements. Information sources, funding streams, stable organizations, and finding effective ways to empower and support new activists. So there's been important organizing both locally and on the state level, since it's been hard to change policies on the national level. And people have really focused on that. So, okay, if the US pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, which is very dangerous in terms of climate change, but what can be done on the local level, on the state level, to move so that New York State moves more quickly towards a 100% renewable energy sourcing, which isn't something that the federal government controls. So part of that is all of us learning more clearly where does authority reside for different kinds of decision-making and policy-making. And on healthcare as well. You know, we're very, very close here in New York State to the passage of something called the New York Health Act, which would be a single-payer healthcare system for New York State, something that would lower the cost and increase the services for like 98% of us here in the state. About 2% of the people would pay more than they currently pay for healthcare. All of the craziness that you have to deal with in terms of deciding on healthcare plans and premiums and co-pays and maximum out-of-pockets and maximum family stuff, all of that would sort of disappear. And so progressive taxes would fund a system that would pay for our healthcare. So that would be both very, very significant for those of us who happen to live in New York State, and also would be the first state to create such a system, which hopefully would then become a national model that we could move towards. Another important victory that happened this summer in a place we don't think of as a progressive bastion particularly was in Missouri, where they passed a referendum overwhelmingly that overturned what's called right-to-work laws, which are heavily anti-union and make it much more difficult for unions to organize. Also, more recently, you know, we've seen primary results that shock people. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the Bronx and Queens being elected as an open democratic socialist over someone in the House leadership. The recent primary win, and I'm forgetting her name, an African-American woman in the Boston area, who again defeated a longtime congressperson. So there's some real momentum and opportunities that are opened up by this grave threat that we face. And with that, so there's many more candidates that are running for office, many more contested elections, more people of color running as candidates, more LGBTAI candidates, more Muslim candidates. So that's really exciting and holds the prospect of there being a much stronger progressive bloc in Congress after these elections. And that's been true locally as well, that Joe Driscoll, someone who I worked with closely in Bernie Sanders' campaign, is now on the Common Council here in Syracuse and trying to push forward much more progressive policies there. Dana Balter, who is a visiting professor here at Maxwell, is running for Congress and I think has a really pretty good chance of winning. Rachel May, another person who's here at SU, is running for state senate. Shadia Tadros is running for a city court judge. So there's real interesting things happening in that regard. How are we doing on time? There's no clock here for me.
We have 25 minutes.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to go over some things that I see as looking forward kinds of concepts, and then open it up for questions. This new Rise Up project that I've begun and am working with several other local organizers on is really focused on the idea that we need to become more serious about how we work with and prepare the next generation of activists. We all know if you want to become a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, a plumber, an electrician, there's training you need to do that. And while some of us do it ourselves, in some ways we at least watch some YouTube videos or things like that to do it. But there's this general sense out there that organizing is sort of that there's nothing to it. You just do it. And I think that's incorrect, and it prevents us from being as productive and effective as we could be. So to really help people remain involved in organizing work, to help them understand the systemic nature of the problems we face, that this isn't just surface issues, and to develop the skills to work more effectively. Again, those of us who are white need to learn more from people of color, to hear their experiences, their understanding of how to move forward on things, and really take heed of it, to learn to listen more and talk less. And that's true with all kinds of marginalized peoples, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of ability, in terms of gender, in terms of religion. So we really need to take that work more seriously about understanding privilege and working to combat. Hard on the local and state issues where we can make progress and move things forward. So that, for example, here in Syracuse, the police contract, they just agreed on a police contract for the last 2 years. And now they're going to move to negotiate the current contract. And a big issue in terms of police accountability here is that the union contract has enabled police to not cooperate with the Civilian Review Board that investigates charges of police misconduct or brutality. So we need to push our elected officials to change that so that police are held accountable. We need to continue to resist the federal policies which threaten us and our neighbors in whatever ways we can. We need to find ways to connect with the people who supported Trump. All of us, or most of us, I imagine, have some of those people in our lives, whether they're people we're close to or people who we interact with more distantly. So to try and figure out, how can we ask questions, try to understand and find gentle ways to sort of offer different understandings, different information. And we need to build movements which are sustainable and find ways to feed ourselves in the process. Work for activism is difficult work, organizing work. You don't, if you're one of the few who has a paid job doing it, you don't get paid much money. It's very hard work. You don't have the resources you need. If you're doing it on top of your other work, that's challenging in and of itself. So we need to also do the things that feed ourselves, whether that's listening to music or walking in the woods, cooking, hanging out with friends, whatever, that we need to do that and not sort of become martyrs for the cause. We're wanting this to be attractive to other people. So if what they see is, there's those organizers and activists who are always hunched over and looking callow because they're inside in meetings all the time, that's not a very attractive kind of image for folks. So one of my longtime heroes is a woman named Emma Goldman, who is an anarchist organizer who, one of her most famous phrases is, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." So maybe everyone here doesn't like to dance, but there's some other aspects of what's a joyous, happy, fulfilling life that need to be part of the work that we're doing. So I want to close by saying that for me, I think it's important for people to recognize that there's no more important work that we can do than creating a just, peaceful, and sustainable world. And I thought about, I'm a parent as well, and being a parent is also an amazingly fulfilling thing. But in some ways, for me, that work in the broader world is recognizing that my responsibility as a parent extends to all the children, not just the ones that I'm directly helping to raise. And at the same time, that engaging that process of working to change the world is one of the most rewarding things that you can do. The sense of camaraderie and commitment and passion that people feel as we engage in this work is really profound and something that you're not going to get a lot of other places. Ironically, one of the other places I believe people get it is when they're fighting in wars together. So I'm going to stop there. No? October.
Oh, October.
Okay, so I'll stop there.